What is the future of Christianity? Two approaches, understanding, paths. Francis Berger. The future of Christianity has been a major theme of this blog. I assume the theme is also a major point of interest and/or concern to this blog's readers. In light of this, I will focus more explicitly on Christianity's potential ways forward, primarily by examining two distinct approaches, understandings and paths of Christianity, and its future development. The Anti-Gnostic, a valued commenter on this blog, outlines the first approach/understanding/path in a reply to the question of when Christianity would reignite the West. Bold added,
"It won't. Christianity requires a Christendom with geographic territory and artifacts, which Christians blew up after 2 world wars against each other. When Christians aren't protected or don't protect themselves, they go extinct like anybody else. The religions which actually propagate themselves maintain blood and soil homelands or enclaves that support natalism, literal creation, in which nominal Christians no longer participate, like Islam, Judaism and the Anabaptists. Religion as metaphysical abstraction is just anyone's opinion. It has no tangible or tactile representation, no means for intergenerational transmission, no temporal events or life cycle rituals. It actually eschews tangibility and tactileness as mundane and mortifying. It's just the burden of praxis with no benefit other than a narrative of an unknown, theoretical afterlife." Bruce Charlton outlines the second approach in response to the same question. Note that the commenters were unaware of each other's comments when they posted their thoughts on the matter, Bold added. "This is why I try, more and more, to emphasize that Christianity ought to be about the next world, in the sense that our understanding of this world, and what we should be doing, comes after we have decided to follow Jesus to life everlasting in heaven, and do what is necessary to attain that. In contrast, there is a common discourse, and I used to be deeply into this, that evaluates Christianity in terms such as its ability to save Western civilization from itself, or improve the conditions of my life, soon. It is natural to desire protection from suffering, yet in an entropic world leading towards death, this is ultimately futile, and therefore should not be allowed to take primacy, as it so often does take primacy, in both explicitly secular and fake Christian discourse."
In my view, questions concerning the future of Christianity boil down to the cardinal choice between these two approaches, understandings and paths. The choice individual Christians make in this regard will determine the future of Christianity, or, put another way, if Christianity has a future at all. Note added, "I believe that Christianity has a future. For me, the big question centers more on the question of what Christianity will be in the future, which of course depends on the present choices and assumptions of Christians. Mostly, in this mortal life, entropy and evil are what kill men. God's creation sustains us alive, for his purposes." Bruce Charlton. I hope the title is largely self-explanatory. In this mortal state we all live in an entropic world. Among many evil beings, the tendency towards death is endemic, omnipresent, cumulative, and therefore we will always die, sooner or later. What sustains us alive in face of this constant tendency to change, corruption, disintegration, degeneration and disease, is that we are each a part of God's creation. Thus life is a continuing and moment-by-moment divine gift of God, continual, that is, for so long as God sustains it, until God's creation is overwhelmed by evil acts, or inevitably/eventually by entropy. In a basic and overall sense, therefore, it is not God that kills us, and also we may be killed against God's plan for us, against personal divine destiny, especially when acutely overwhelmed by evil intent. However, while we live, it is God that is keeping us alive. Yet God may withdraw his creative sustenance, and then we will soon die from evil or entropy. God is keeping us alive for his divine, creative purposes, including the hope that we will choose salvation when we die, and thereby escape both entropy and evil, by entering the second creation, and will learn the spiritual lessons that would most benefit us while we live. Those who have been sustained alive for unusually long periods, into extreme old age, might therefore assume that this is for the purpose of our divine destiny, either in hope we shall choose salvation, or in hope that we will learn something God regards as important for us. Recognizing final participation, inspiration plus personal creativity. Bruce Charlton. If we assume that because final participation is our destiny, what God wants from us at this stage of things, then perhaps it ought not to be impossibly difficult or rare. Perhaps we should expect to see final participation in our own lives, and in those of at least some people whose work is recoded in the public domain. Maybe the difficulty in locating final participation is in recognizing it as something genuinely different and new, and therefore misclassifying it under old categories, because the old categories are all we know. To clarify, final participation is an engagement with reality, in which we bring to bear our own creativity, to participate in creating. This could be participation with divine creation, this is what I understand to happen in heaven, or participation with another person's created work, perhaps someone from the past. This can serve as an illustration, taking the example of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Two widely known categories of engagement with life, with works, could be termed projection and channeling, and I will contrast these with final participation. Projection? Projection is not intentionally a participation, because it describes what happens when a reader of Tolkien projects his own concerns onto the book. This seems to be the usual practice of Tolkien mass fandom. Except minimally, the projecting fan reader does not experience what Tolkien himself felt or intended, but instead uses the book, selectively and distortingly, as fuel for his own interests. For example, such a fan might read The Lord of the Rings as if it were a sword and sorcery novel, being interested only by the fights, magic, monsters, spectacle etc., and either not noticing, skipping over or forgetting the other material. Or, to judge by the content of one genre of fan fictions, quite a few readers even seem to read Tolkien in a subversive fashion, as fuel for their personal sexual fantasies. Therefore, projection is not a form of participation except very minimally, unconsciously, unintentionally, because the intent is to impose oneself upon the other. Channeling? The ideal behind the form of participation I am calling channeling, is that the reader becomes so totally immersed in the work that he identifies completely with the author. This is a contemplative, not creative, ideally non-participating form of engagement, because the ideal is that the reader be passive, absorptive, and reflective. The reader seeks to lose himself in the work. In other words, with channeling, with inspired work, the ideal is non-participation. This channeling is therefore a particular example of what Owen Barfield termed original participation, which is the primal relationship with the world of the child or the early tribal man. It does have elements of participating, but only in the secondary sense that we are then, and almost fully, engaged with the world, with life, with other beings. But, when channeling works, we are so immersed in the flow of external things, that while our own participation in them is inevitable, it is intentionally minimal. Perhaps the ideal of the medieval sculptor working on one of the great cathedrals might serve as an illustration. He is contented to be anonymous, and forgotten, and to work in exactly the same style as every other mason, because his personal nature should stand aside and should not have anything to do with the product. I have heard of musicians, conductors and soloists, who regard their interpretations likewise. They try to identify so closely with the composer that they lose themselves in the performance altogether. In terms of Tolkien, this is perhaps the ideal of the best kind of literary critic of the old school. He attempts to expound Tolkien, and not to interfere by interjecting personal views or evaluations. In particular, he is very wary of projection, which he regards as itself a gross and unscholarly error, leading to distortions such as anachronism. Final participation. For an example of final participation we need to go to Tolkien himself, in his writing of Lord of the Rings, and to that activity which he termed subcreation. This, I suggest, is the relationship between JRRT and his source material, which came from the author's engagement with his academic subject of philology, the language-focused study of old texts, and his other concerns such as mythology, and the matter of England. I believe that Tolkien not only had a deep immersion in his sources, but that he also went beyond immersion in his sources. That is, JRRT went beyond the contemplative passive processes of channeling, and brought his own creativity to bear on the material that he was experiencing from within. There are innumerable examples. Tolkien's elves are rooted in Icelandic, Norse, Anglo-Saxon, Celtic material from his philosophical studies, the words for elves, their histories, their implications, as discussed by Tom Shippey in Roots and Branches, but Tolkien also brought a deep and intense personal interest and concern with elves, which he envisaged as an ideal type of certain aspects of men, blessed with innate health and extreme longevity, greater love of the earth, greater skills and intelligence, and magical powers. And yet Tolkien felt a need to explain, to himself, primarily, how and why it was that elves were, more or less, estranged from, then replaced by, men, who became rulers of this earth, despite that men seemed inferior, overall. To generate acceptable answers to these, and other, questions about elves, problems about myth, England and so forth, Tolkien needed to go beyond existing material and theories, he needed to enlist his own creativity. I consider Tolkien's writing of The Lord of the Rings as a publicly available example of final participation. In the first place, JRRT was inspired by many, already existing, source materials, and had immersed himself in these materials so that he could, when needed or desired, channel/expound/explain these materials in their own terms, in the context of the times and places of their composition. But in the second place, Tolkien wanted to do more than just passively be inspired by, he wanted actively to generate something new by bringing to bear from himself to participate with that which others had created. This was, pretty much, what he termed subcreation. To generalize, I think it would therefore be reasonably accurate to state that final participation equals inspiration plus personal creativity. As such, examples can be generated from other areas of the arts, sciences, etc. The pianist Glenn Gould did not just channel Bach, as some have wrongly claimed, because, although he was steeped in Bach's creative mind and intent, Gould also added his own creativity to make something participated. A synthesis, rather than recreation. A creative scientist of genius must, of course, build upon the valid science of his precursors, but as well as selecting from among the already existing scientific literature that he deeply understands in its own terms, which might be said to inspire him, and as well as extrapolating this work, the great scientist will bring something new, something original, from himself, in order to make a qualitative breakthrough. In sum, I hope the above might help make clearer what is meant by final participation, and to help recognize when it occurs in our own lives. Loving your enemies entails recognizing the reality of enemies and acting accordingly. Francis Berger. The experience of relationships between beings is a fundamental purpose of creation. Beings are not limited to people but encompass every being in creation. One of the ultimate aims of these relationships is the kindling and expansion of love, not because love is a spiritual activity that serves life but because love suffuses life with its highest meaning and value, which entails that the motivations driving relationships ought to be rooted in the primacy of the spiritual, a primacy in which all beings participate, whether consciously or not. A simple and easy way to describe a relationship is to call it a connection or the state of being connected that arises after initial contact. Relationships are essentially exchanges. From these, communication, correlation, and correspondence emerge. Some of these correlations birth conflict. Yet Christians in antagonistic relationships, relationships based on little more than conflict, can remain aligned with God and creation if they recognize, honor, and respect the primacy of the spiritual, and the spiritual essence of the enemy, even if, or especially if, the enemy rejects, opposes, or denies this primacy and essence. Thus, a man can still love his enemy while fighting against him. Loving one's enemy is not the same as denying one has enemies. Loving one's enemy entails accepting the existence of hostility. Some beings, men, or forces simply must be opposed. Some relationships will inevitably be hostile. Yet a God-aligned man rejects the temptation to hate the man he is fighting even while submerged in the deepest hostilities. He may declare the man an enemy and fight him tooth and nail with everything he has at his disposal, but he will never lose sight of the spiritual essence of his enemy. He might even kill the enemy, but he never aims to spiritually destroy. He knows the enemy may kill him, but also knows that his death is not spiritual destruction. He knows only he can spiritually destroy himself. In the end, he recognizes the enemy as a fellow being in creation and, thus, yearns and prays for the enemy's salvation. Note, hat tip to William James Tykanevich, who once shared the loving your enemies does not mean you don't have enemies insight via a comment somewhere on this blog. Scheler's lucid criticism of Nietzsche's erroneous understanding of true Christian values. Francis Berger. Most Christians are anti-Nietzsche in a reflexive, knee-jerk sort of way. I'm not. On the contrary, I think Nietzsche ranks among the 19th century's leading geniuses, to the point of being prophetic. Yes, he was a prophet of doom with a zoom lens, and his insights into the death of God and its inevitable consequences are prescient and visionary. Having said that, Nietzsche's overall assessment and condemnation of Christianity are largely erroneous and misguided. Why? Because he did not criticize what Christianity is but what Christianity had become. As Max Scheler outlines in Resentiment, Nietzsche's castigation of Christian values is more of a castigation of 19th century bourgeois values than an accurate assessment of true Christian values. Granted, Scheler's thinking was heavily imbued by the rather strict Catholic perspective he held at the time, but this does not diminish or weaken his overall evaluation of Nietzsche's misguided claims about true Christian values. Bold added.
The greatest mistake would be to interpret the Christian movement on the basis of dim analogies with certain forms of the modern social and democratic movement. Jesus is not a kind of popular hero and social politician, a man who knows what ails the poor and the oppressed, an enemy of mammon in the sense that he opposes capitalism as a form of social existence. Yet Friedrich Nietzsche's own conception of Christianity is strongly influenced by this widespread Jesus picture, which was propagated by Christian and non-Christian socialists. Therefore he thinks that the motives and arguments which set him against modern socialism and communism also apply to Christian morality and its genius. But Nietzsche's attack touches Jesus and the core of Christianity as little as the praise of those socialists, since both share the same mistaken premise. Christianity does not contain the germ of modern socialist and democratic tendencies and value judgments. Nor did it ever affirm the equality of souls before God, to which Nietzsche always points as the root of democracy, except in the sense that God's judgment on men is preceded by an elimination of the value delusions which are due to human situations, to human narrow-mindedness, blindness, and self-interest. But the notion that all men are equivalent in God's eyes, that all value distinctions and the whole value aristocracy of human existence are merely based on anthropomorphic prejudice, one-sidedness, and weakness, is reminiscent of Spinoza and entirely foreign to Christianity.
Sadly, most Christians have utterly lost the plot when it comes to true Christian values. Thus, what parades around as Christianity and Christian values today are the exact things Nietzsche so vividly and accurately condemned. The Nature of the Normans, Binge-watching/listening to John Le Carre adaptations. Bruce Charlton. My spontaneous aversion to England's Norman ruling class goes back a long way, and used to be so strong, in some respects, that until last week I had never been able to get myself to read, or watch an adaptation of, John Le Carre's famously excellent Cold War spy stories, often concerning the classic fictional character of George Smiley, and taking place in the world of the Normans. Having found the 1965 movie of the spy who came in from the cold to be thought-provoking and resonant, I then watched another movie, and the BBC TV series of Tinker, Tailor Soldier, Spy and Smiley's People, starring Alec Guinness, and also listened to some more radio play adaptations. A real binge. I enjoyed a lot about these works, and have found myself stimulated in several directions. Yet at bottom I find the whole atmosphere of the social world depicted as alien. I dislike all of the characters, even Smiley, who all seem to have blunted humanity and zero metaphysical depth. I've had enough for now. Even the undeniable courage of these Normans seems to be tainted with a suspicion that it comes from insensibility combined with sensation-seeking, for example through sex, drink, violence, sadism, self-humiliation, infighting, betrayal, snobbery, etc., anything that rings your bell, to pass the time. Underpinning which is a weird sense of Norman tribalism, rooted in their assumed superiority to laws and rules intended for the little people, that destroys any possibility of genuine justice, and indeed any possibility of being personally affiliated to the cause of good. This combination is seen very early in Norman English history, for example the Anarchy. In other words, Le Carre's world, at least in these versions, is nihilistic and futile, and is inhabited by men and women who strike me as nihilistic at their very core. I assume this reflects Le Carre's own considerable strengths and limitations as a man. In an interview I watched, he was extremely intelligent, insightful and interesting, yet underneath I sensed nothing. What I am talking about is something missing, something human that is missing. It's as if, for Norman's life is a game, but nothing more than a game. The game is arbitrary, war, seduction, snobbery, diplomacy, sport, literature, careerism, it doesn't matter, but the game has neither meaning nor purpose, because for Normans there is none to be had. Each Norman plays a part, tries to play it well, or, at least, to sabotage the others, because that is the best way to fill in time, but it is nothing more than a part which is played, and ultimately the game doesn't really matter, because nothing ultimately matters. I assume that this deficiency, and the consequent blankness, is what David Icke are getting at when they call these people, and some other social groups as well, Normans are not the only ones, reptilians, lizard people, or actual extraterrestrials. I would assume, rather, that it is some mixture of an innate deficiency in the capacity for love, with varying degrees of demonic influence and control. The news or nihilism, your self-imposed only choice. Bruce Charlton. We modern people substantially make our reality, thus choose our reality, just look around you. So primal/childhood unconsciousness and instinct is not an option, not if we are to live as a human among humans. And anyone who is genuinely prepared to hand back the human ticket and live as an unconscious, instinctive animal, would not be arguing about it, just shutting up and doing it. Yes, but what reality do we choose? En masse, on average, we choose the news. That is reality. Whatever the news says is what passes for objectivity. Despite that the news is incoherent, labile and evil, it is the only reality we have. We are, to some extent, allowed to select from within the news, i.e. the approved media, the ones that are not blocked, we have that freedom. We can therefore, each and all of us, be unique individuals, with our very own choice and combination of official news reality, EP. But suppose we reject the news, what then? If we do not live in the world of the news, what other world may we inhabit? Behind the news is nihilism, nothingness, non-objectivity. You step outside the news, and you are on your own, mate. You will then inhabit a world where there is only your word against the world. Look around, and you will find many news stories with this subtext. They may even acknowledge that the news hates you, and wants you dead. Actually, they really want you damned, but can't say it within the materialism of the news. The news may rub it in your face that they are trying to immiserate, hurt, maim and kill you. But then, what else is there? Leave the news and you are dead anyway. Or maybe you have a few allies, but then so what? Family and some friends is not the economy. You don't have police, army, control of the laws, ability to print money, or the mass media to label you a disgusting, dumb, evil outlaw, and declare open season on you. You don't have a linked bureaucracy that extends almost everywhere and supplies almost everything. You can't live separate from the news, and if you even try and show any sign of succeeding, the news will stop you whenever it wants. Such is life. Such is life on the mainstream secular worldview, materialistic metaphysics, which everybody is taught and which is everywhere reinforced in the public domain, not mainly by statements, but wholly by assumptions. God, heaven, the soul, the spirit, creation, reality of values, our whole public world is built and functions on the basis that none of these are real. In the bureaucracies which run everything nowadays, all rules and procedures exclude the reality of God/creation/soul/spirit etc. etc. There is just the news, the objectivity to the current establishment diktat, which is always a lie, or there is nihilism, nothing, mere subjectivity, which is not even a lie. On the one hand we have belief in the news, hence obedient service to purposive evil. On the other hand, if we reject the news, there is fear, leading to despair. Such are the choices in our materialist, God excluding, heaven excluding, spirit excluding etc. worldview, and our world functions on materialist assumptions. Modern men are, for the only time in history, absolutely imprisoned by their assumptions, by their metaphysics. And, while modern men hold these assumptions, they have nowhere to turn but the news, nowhere to run but into nihilism. No escape that is not worse than whatever they already have. We cannot escape, even in our thoughts, because, according to our deepest beliefs, reality, justice, the news backed by nihilism. Our prison is absolutely secure, because it is self-chosen, and the cage is double-locked because we refuse to acknowledge that we have thus chosen, and continue thus to choose, day by day, minute by minute. So long as we personally, and culturally, exclude that extended reality of God, heaven, the spirit, life beyond life etc., we shall necessarily remain trapped by the dilemma of the news versus nihilism. If, on the other hand, we choose to acknowledge the reality of God, divine creation, if we choose the possibility of heaven, and primacy of eternal spirit, then we are escaped already. Having escaped, the task of our life, our purpose or destiny, can begin. But not until after we have escaped. Agree to disagree. William Wildblood. There is a very civilized and reasonable view current today, that we should respect those whose opinions we do not share. We may disagree with such people, but we should not demonize anyone just because they might think differently to us. There's room in the world for all sorts of ideas, and to condemn another person because he sees things in a different light is to fall into a confusion between person and ideas. It might even lead to violence. How appealing is such a thought? How sane and just. And yet I disagree with it. Just as faith is a matter of will rather than intellect, so there is right and wrong thought, and often, not always but often, those who embrace wrong thought do so because of some spiritual flaw in their character. Their beliefs are the result of their personal shortcomings. This is becoming more and more the case as things come to a point, and the sheep are separated out from the goats, which appears to be the overarching theme of the present time. A time, be it noted, when the teaching of Jesus Christ really has been spread to every corner of the globe, as was given as a necessary precursor to the end times. Perhaps at one time it was viable to have the wrong ideas if you were genuinely engaged with the search for truth. After all, none of us is right all the time, or even wholly right any of the time. But we have to see why people think what they think or argue what they argue. Increasingly, those who have put themselves on the wrong side, which is the side against God and the natural order of creation, do so because of the disordered state of their soul, and we cannot grant them equal rights. It is quite reasonably said we should always attack the argument, not the person, but sometimes the argument is the person. When I first became interested in spiritual matters, I adopted a universal approach, taking nectar from a variety of flowers, from both temperate and tropical climes, from gardens, forests and jungles. Sorry, I got a bit carried away there, but I learnt a lot thereby, with different approaches filling in the gaps of others. Christianity, and specifically Jesus Christ, was always central to my spiritual understanding, but it was supported by other approaches. However, as time has gone by and the dire spiritual state of the world becomes more exposed, I see that only the person of Christ can really save us from the assault. Pretty much everything else, including official Christianity, can be incorporated into the anti-God agenda, and often is. Only Christ can offer real refuge against spiritual evil. I don't say other spiritual approaches cannot be valid on their own terms, but the centrality of Christ is becoming ever more evident. Relativism is one of the curses of the modern age. You have your truth and I have mine, and both are equally good. No, the unalterable fact is there is truth and there are lies, and they are not to be given equal consideration. What's new in the Satanic agenda since 2020? War, mainly? Bruce Charlton. The greatest novelty from the global establishment since the totalitarian coup of 2020 is surely war, specifically engineering and escalating World War III, presented as a good thing or even as an absolutely essential thing. This is a tough sell for the totalitarians, because the kind of war which is being pushed for will destroy all the, albeit incoherent, aims of the existing major core leftist issues, by which the world has been changed. All out, everywhere, world war, will put an end to Great Reset type concerns about a climate emergency, the trans agenda, anti-racism, and all the rest of that kind of thing. All these leftist evil agendas depend upon the rulers and their minions accepting, and living by, the delusion that their pet projects will incrementally be implemented in a future society dedicated to this kind of stuff. Of course, these pet projects are all in actuality socially destructive in effect, and therefore can never really be implemented, because the more rapidly the agendas succeed, the more rapidly society will crumble, so the authorities will be unable to impose them. That awareness of the incompatibility of World War 2023 style with new left totalitarianism is, however, blocked by continual propaganda and the continual construction of a virtual reality, a virtuality existing in a closed circle of mutually reinforcing mass media with bureaucratic statements and rules. But war. It is indeed a very tough sell to convince bureaucrats and media moguls that a long-term, unrestricted, international war will be compatible with their cherished ideologies. Because it simply isn't. Yet, remarkably, for the past year and a half, they do seem to have been convinced. Convinced by a combination of multiple total lies with increased censorship, and levels of frenzied national demonization not seen for a century. Indeed, recent demonization and persecutions of the Fire Nation and its citizens have been in some ways, especially financial and economic, never before seen anywhere or at any time in the modern era. The leadership/minion class has not even noticed that the sanctions and measures imposed ostensibly to destroy the Fire Nation have, in fact and surely quite clearly, harmed the imposing nations, and that was their intention from the very start, which is why they continue to be escalated. By such means, the war has been used to accelerate the purposive suicide of the West being Satan's prime target in recent generations, even above the Fire Nation. So, the stupidity and obedience of the rulers and their minions turns out to be very great indeed, and they really seem not to have noted the gross and widening discrepancy between the bureaucratic media version of reality, and what they can observe and experience for themselves. But the longer the situation continues, and the wider the gap in realities, the more difficult it seems to be to sell a proposed war of unprecedented destruction as being, somehow, helpful to the attainment of the totalitarian leftist utopia of Agenda 2030, and the Great Reset. I think that this is what is going on behind the scenes of the Western establishment at present. All the participants are affiliated with evil, servants of Satan, but the mostly evil harmonic totalitarians are, at last, starting to wake up to the incompatibility of their ultra-controlled worldview with the chaos of wreckage and killing, favored by of the more wholly evil sorothic spiteful destroyers. I personally do not want either of these groups to prevail. Indeed, the mostly but partly evil totalitarians' vision of a world of omni-surveillance and total mind control is spiritually even worse than a world of total war, horrific bodily suffering, and mega-death. Mankind has painted itself into this satanic corner, by many generations of wrong and evil choices and decisions, and by continuing in these falsehoods. There are no good options for the world. Maybe we will be faced with a choice between supporting wholesale spiritual destruction, totalitarianism, or else supporting gross physical destruction, war. Certainly that seems like the way that Satan desires us to see things. I hope that, when the crunch comes, I will choose neither. Living in a world where the system lives between us and creation. Francis Berger. The other day, a colleague enthusiastically asked me what I thought of the Hungarian scientist who had been awarded a Nobel for the research that went into making the Birdemic PEX. I did not respond, but my unenthusiastic expression prompted my colleague to comment that it appeared that I did not give a shit. I said she was right, which motivated her to ask why. I muttered something about it all being unscrupulous and used the example of the former US president winning the Peace Prize in 2009 to support my claim. Yes, but this is a Hungarian. Doesn't that mean something? Sure, that's all fine and well, but the technology didn't work, I said flatly. My colleague looked at me incredulously. I took the peck, and I didn't fall ill. I chose to change the subject after that. To my relief, my colleague eagerly went along with the shift in focus. That brief exchange remained in my mind for hours because earlier that day, I had been thinking about how the system lives between us and creation and how this amorphous barrier is most glaring in human relationships. As I noted in a post the other day, the experience of relationships between beings is a fundamental purpose of creation. Beings are not limited to people but encompass every being in creation. One of the ultimate aims of these relationships is the kindling and expansion of love, not because love is a spiritual activity that serves life but because love suffuses life with its highest meaning and value, which entails that the motivations driving relationships ought to be rooted in the primacy of the spiritual, a primacy in which all beings participate, whether consciously or not. A simple and easy way to describe a relationship is to call it a connection or the state of being connected that arises after initial contact. Relationships are essentially exchanges. From these, communication, correlation, and correspondence emerge. If relationships between beings is a fundamental purpose of creation, then creation must be acknowledged as the medium for relationships. The powers aligned against God and creation appear to be acutely aware of the ultimate significance of relationships in creation, our relationship with God foremost among them, and one of their all-encompassing goals lies in the disruption and destruction of relationships between beings, primarily by firmly wedging their system in between beings and creation and insisting that the system be the only medium of relational exchange and communication between all beings in creation. The 2020 global birdemic coup offers a recent and vivid example of this motivation to live between beings and control relationships in creation. For about 2 years, the powers opposed to God and creation succeeded in severely curtailing, disrupting, forbidding, and diminishing relationships. Not only that, but they also dictated the rules of relational engagement. They monitored, recorded, surveyed, micromanaged, manipulated, supervised, controlled, and regulated all relationships at all levels. Relationships became contingent upon the system's bureaucratic machinations. Terms like social distancing suddenly became acceptable and common in human discourse, as did notions of transformed societies in which none are safe until are safe. And let's not forget that the churches, meant to serve as a direct social and spiritual connection to God and creation, eagerly and actively allowed the system to eclipse creation and live between congregations and God in 2020. The birdemic was the most tangible exhibition of the dark powers yearning to have their system live between beings and creation. In many ways, it represents the culmination of an insidious and seemingly ubiquitous stratagem to obscure creation as the foundation of all communication between beings and replace it with the system. Most of my interactions with most people amount to little more than system interactions. People everywhere relate to each other only through the system. And this is not limited to interpersonal relationships between humans. It extends to all creation. I struggle to remember the last time I heard someone speak about nature or weather without referring to the climate crisis or environmentalism. Virtually all of organized, institutional Christianity has reduced itself to broadcasting system-dictated agenda items, issues, and talking points. The system only lives between us and creation because we allow it to. No, more than that. We actively desire that the system live between us and creation. Relationships in creation require free, autonomous, thinking agents motivated by and capable of love and creativity. Only such agents can know creation directly and form knowing relationships in creation. Very few people appear interested in forming relationships in creation because most people seem utterly uninterested in freedom, autonomy, and thinking, to say nothing of love and creativity. It's far easier to permit the system to live between us. A few years ago, I made a case for something I referred to as system distancing by emphasizing that such distancing was primarily a spiritual movement motivated by the mostly internal aim of drawing away from the system and closer to God and creation. Such a spiritual movement within individuals remains imperative. Although it is largely an internal movement, it is impossible alone. It requires relationships with other beings in creation. Above all, it requires a relationship with Christ because the only way we can ever hope to reconnect to creation now is through Jesus. Everything else is just the system living between us. The fake nature of geopolitical discourse, all things to all men, hence an instrument of the devil. Bruce Charlton. Everybody loves geopolitical explanations, at least, everybody in the mass media, and most people elsewhere. And yet, using geopolitical analysis, which sounds hard-nosed, and, sort of, objective, everybody reaches a different conclusion. This should serve as a warning, a red flag, that we are dealing with something that is evil, and evil not by its usage but by its very nature. In other words, we engage in evil when we use and believe geopolitical discourse to discuss and analyze world events. Geopolitics is wrong for two main reasons, or classes of reason. The first and most fundamental wrongness is that geopolitics is materialistic in its assumptions. Geopolitics excludes the reality of God, creation and all that is of the spirit. Because these are excluded, and yet these are real and primary, geopolitical discourse misses out most of what is most important. Secondly, geopolitics is wrong because it has too many, too subjective, too imprecise variables. For a start, geopolitical analysis is based upon evaluating interest, in the sense of benefit. In other words, asking who benefits overall from options X versus Y or Z. Yet this matter of what interest means, or what benefit is overall most important, is utterly vague and conjectural. Because we cannot perceive another's motivations, all such imputations are, at bottom, little more than guesswork and assumption, that can neither be confirmed nor refuted, because in practice all possible outcomes are compatible with all imputations of interest. Any person, and more so any institution, corporation, ethnic group or nation, has many things that might be called interests, many possible ways in which, we suppose, they might benefit: money, power, fame, sex, and many more ways in which they might wish to avoid harms and suffering, poverty, humiliation, pain, confinement. We can't ever be validly confident concerning which interest is actually important, or most important, or how the various interests might interact. And there will surely be other genuine interests we do not know, have not thought about, or which we underrate. This fundamental and fatal imprecision in geopolitics is compounded by further variables, two in particular: time scale, and interest group boundaries. Time scale. What is best in the short term of here and now, is almost never the best possibility in the longer term. Conversely, the best long-term possibilities are nearly always associated with immediate disadvantage or serious risk. So, geopolitical analysis has vast, and fatal, wriggle room in identifying self-interest, and other kinds of interest, since almost any time scale can be used to explain things, from the immediate and tactically useful, to many and various longer-term and strategic advantages. Ultimate long-term benefit can be assumed for anything from days, weeks and months ahead, to years or even decades ahead, and such assumed benefit can therefore explain almost any activity leading to almost any outcome. Interest group boundary. On top of all this, there is the question of who exactly is supposed to be benefiting. Such benefit comes at every level between extremes of the individual, and the entirety of the human population. Some specific individual, such as a monarch, president, or dictator, or also their family and minions. Or should it be assumed that some rival person or faction stands to benefit? Are we talking about a class, like Marxists? Or are we talking about a race or religion? Or maybe it is a corporation or some other social institution, like a profession of a branch of government like the military. At a larger scale, are we talking about a whole nation's interest, or maybe some larger alliance of nations? Or it is the globalist perspective that is being promoted, with multinational organizations? Or maybe the interest being sought is that of a secret cabal or conspiracy? I hope it is, by now, sufficiently clear that geopolitics is so imprecise and slippery a discourse that it can explain anything in any number of ways, can blame anyone, or nobody, with equal pseudo-validity. It can impute almost any kind of motivations and intentions, across almost any time frame. And, in sum, I hope it is clear that geopolitical analysis is a fake. So, why do we all so easily and often fall into it? I do not exempt myself. The reason is that geopolitical discourse is ultimately a demonic temptation, and, as Jesus told us, we are all sinners. Many of us will fall to the temptations of geopolitics, especially when so many other people are doing it, all the time. Geopolitics is inescapable, because geopolitical discourse functions at high levels of power, where people take such matter seriously, to justify anything to anyone. Consider a war, as an example. Geopolitics can appeal to the interests of people on opposite sides of wars, to all kinds of rival factions within those sides and crossing those sides, and reference interest across all timescales. Such that everybody and every group, at least all with power, may simultaneously believe that he is pursuing his interests by starting a war, escalating a war, pursuing that war. Now, imagine that, behind all the geopolitical discourse was some person or group, call him Satan, who wanted war, or societal destruction, starvation, torment, disease. Wanted these for their own sake, from sheer spitefulness, because they made him feel good. Because that is his nature. Satan could pursue his destructive goals via geopolitics, by identifying powerful individuals and groups, and encouraging them all to pursue particular kinds of self-interest. Different groups, different benefits, different timescales. So, in the end, lots of people and groups were following Satan's agenda of destruction, but each and all of them were under the impression that each was pursuing his own self-interest. Various kinds of interest, over some various time frames. Such is the nature of our world, and increasingly so. We cannot cease to sin altogether, but we can recognize and repent our sins, and that is what we ought to do in relation to geopolitics. We can recognize that geopolitics is a fake discipline, that provides fake explanations to order, and is therefore used to manipulate people towards underlying goals of which they may all be unaware. Because behind geopolitics lies the spiritual war of this world, and that, not geopolitics, is where we should be looking for explanations and guidance. To clarify, those who desire to trigger, sustain or escalate the destructiveness of war, will typically try to work using individuals and groups on both sides of the conflict, agents who, using geopolitical arguments, can both simultaneously be convinced that war will be in their own interests, of one sort or another, power, money, religious, in one time scale or another, but, in war, usually short-medium term. A positive, freedom for spin on sustainable development goals. Francis Berger. I have been contemplating my earlier reinterpretations of Sustainable Development Goals, SDG, as sorothic destruction goals or sorothic destruction guaranteed, and I have realized that, though fitting, they are entirely oppositional in nature, good examples of what I often refer to as a freedom from stance. Freedom from is necessary but inadequate. More is needed. SDGs also require a positive freedom for reinterpretation. Sol Deo Gloria is a good start. I also like spiritual development goals. 2. Freedom for possibilities to keep in mind the next time you encounter the forces opposed to God and creation droning on about their cherished SDGs. Responding to the spiritual manipulations of a fake pennant event. Bruce Charlton. Fake pennant events abound, through history, and now. A big one has recently happened with the obvious intent to provoke another war front and escalate the ongoing World War III. So far, the fake pennant seems to be having the effect intended by its devisers. But all this is, for almost everybody in the world, as yet, a remote geopolitical event, known only very indirectly, very incompletely, and with distortion, via the media. Yet most of us will, nonetheless, immediately and increasingly feel the strength of manipulation pressing upon us. First emotional, then spiritual manipulation. That is our first warning, when we take one step back from unconscious emotions, rendering them into conscious feelings, and recognize that we are being manipulated. We can feel the externally desired responses arising in us. We find ourselves spontaneously taking sides in a conflict between evils. What should we do? Become aware, then understand what is ongoing, and understand spiritually, rather than materially. As of 2023, all the big things of which we are made aware by the mass media are spiritual issues primarily, else we would not be getting so many big guns firing at us so loudly and often. Like all such things now, we are dealing with lies, and whatever truth there may be, and sometimes there is no relevant truth, some of the biggest lies are rooted in total lies. We should not become distracted by trying to do what we cannot possibly do, understand the true material causes of the material problem. We cannot uncover the specifics of conspiracy, but we can recognize that something is not what it seems. By the way the event is propagated in spiritual terms, which we know from self-monitoring, and noting and comparing the responses of rulers and of the masses and known individuals, we can be sure that there have been and are elements working to generate and interpret a fake pennant event. The intention of a fake pennant can again be understood from self-monitoring. Currently, the intent is to provoke cycles of resentment and fear to seek some kind of final solution by destruction, some solution depending on the annihilation of the problem, for example particular people, or a particular place. For the remote masses, the intent is to provoke material fear and despair, rooted in the open-endedly horrific prospects of physical suffering, as war spreads between and within nations. Our job as Christians is to recognize that we are being manipulated into fear, resentment and despair, and to reject the validity of these spiritual responses as sinful. We cannot resist having these feelings altogether, but we can reject their validity, which is called repentance. This entails recalling, and affirming inwardly, that the real war of this world is, now as always, spiritual, not material. We should also take confidence from the truth that our own personal awareness, understanding, affiliations, attitudes etc. really make a difference in the real world, and that is exactly why they are being manipulated so aggressively. Even just noticing what is happening spiritually, seeing through the lies and seeing the demonic at work, by perceiving the workings of evil in oneself, has an immediate and positive effect. To understand and reject it, even more so. To transcend all this and take an inwardly God-aligned perspective, more so still. So there is much that each and every one can and should be doing. Of course, this whole thing needs to be done again and again. For instance, it should be relatively easy to accomplish when the problems are merely in the mass media, merely remote, virtual and conceptual. It may be much harder to accomplish when the problems become personal and experiential, as sooner or later they must, if the problem is really real, or even if the problem is merely treated and regarded as real. Such is life. We are here to learn, and keep learning, for as long as we are alive. Don't worry, this was inevitable. William Wildblood. It's hard to watch the civilization of which you are a part destroy itself, especially when that civilization has created many great and noble things and reached heights that earlier civilizations had not attained, both in terms of art, science on the human scale and religion on the spiritual. And it's perplexing that so many people don't see this, though I suspect that more are beginning to do so as the suicidal nature of our civilization becomes increasingly evident, and its behavior increasingly absurd. It's also strange that so many members of that civilization seem hell-bent on dragging it down into the mire. We talk of envy and resentment, and these are obviously major drivers in this scenario, but are they really sufficient to explain the sheer lunacy of much present-day behavior? I don't think they are. Large numbers of people in the modern age suffer from a profound spiritual disorder, and one can only speculate what has caused this. Is it the self-hatred of the decadent? Or is it the rebellion against God of the proud? And yet, although it is difficult to stand by and watch things get worse by the day, disguised by our relative prosperity, for people can put up with a lot if their stomachs are full, it is important that we do not succumb to despair, and the best way to avoid this is to realize two things. 1. Nothing lasts in this world. Everything goes through a spring, summer, autumn and winter cycle. This is how things are in a world in which decay or entropy is the backdrop to everything, as it must be in a material world, since only spirit endures. We are now in deep midwinter. Then we must realize that the West had the defects of its qualities. For a while the latter dominated, but now the former have emerged and are bringing the whole thing down. Our civilization contained the seeds of its own destruction, and these have now sprouted and the weeds are choking the flowers. The main quality of the West was the strong sense of an individual self and the concomitant idea of freedom. This has made our civilization. But its downside is the egotism and, more especially, the tendency of self to remove God from his throne and install itself there. This is what we have done both collectively and individually. The idea that we can remake creation in our own image is a consequence of that. The West also birthed the machine through its exploration of natural science. This had the benefits we know, but it was also a Frankenstein's monster that has certainly turned against us. Materially miraculous but spiritual deadly. Would we have been better off without it? That's the wrong way to look at the situation. The advent of the machine had to be as all possibilities must work themselves out at the end of an age, which is where we currently are. We could have reacted better to it, but the descent of consciousness into matter made it inevitable in some form. The second bulwark against any despair that might arise as our world crumbles is to realize that our true home is not here but heaven. This life is a learning experience. We are only visitors, and the world is a bridge, not a home. If we are alive now, that is because we are meant to be alive now. There are lessons we can learn and service we can render, and perhaps the most important is the one I have just stated. We should value the past, but we cannot preserve it because nothing in it can last forever. On the other hand, nothing good, nothing true can ever be lost. Anything good here is but a dim reflection of a reality elsewhere. Perfection exists, but it is not here. This world is just to make us worthy of it. The material civilization of the West is passing, but all the good in it will be taken up and absorbed into heaven. Crisis? What crisis? The best time for spiritual action. Bruce Charlton. When there is an official crisis, as at present, all the presented options are wrong, because all are misdirections from what we ought to be doing. The three options at present are actively to support one side or the other, or active pacifism. The idea is encapsulated by the message behind the illustration above: we, each and all, should do something. Now. Before it is too late. And that something we must do is always material, physical, socio-political, even if, nowadays, symbolic, virtual. In effect, the presented options are all attempting a negation of the negative, which is not a positive. The crisis is the negative, and the choice of actions are designed to negate that negative. In theory, this might be asserted as clearing the ground for something positive, but that only applies when there is a positive to begin with. And here and now, there just isn't. To demand we do something, when all the somethings are supportive of one evil or another, is a recipe for making things worse. What about when the underlying problem of the crisis is spiritual, not material, including the exclusion of the spiritual as well as the prevalent value inversion? What then? Well, clearly, the response to a spiritually caused crisis ought to be spiritual, and yet, the urgency is always for some choice of physical action. They always say, and with upfront validity, let's just sort out this crisis first, and then, when this immediate and acute situation is over, that is the right time when we can, and should, sort out the spiritual stuff. Superficially sensible. Apparently the only realistic option, but only if you fail to notice that aiding evil, of any kind, is bound to make matters worse overall, and worse spiritually, because that is exactly what we are supposed to set aside. So, what we are being asked to do is to select between counterproductive options, especially when the crisis has not, yet, physically upon us, except virtually, and when the inhabitants of totalitarian bureaucracies are, by design, materially powerless. And, what when the crisis is never over, but instead we move, or rather, are moved, from one emergency to the next? The time for spiritual re-evaluation will never be ripe, will never happen. Yet, if or when a crisis is resolved, and another has not been assembled, then the spiritual urgency has diminished, the masses are then lulled and distracted by the pleasures of peace and prosperity. Official crisis is always the necessary time for spiritual re-evaluation, when issues become real, when mortal life is revealed for the serious thing it is. Also, spiritual realignment is the only way to solve the crisis. From where we now stand, all options are bad, all futures are negative, all actions lead to greater harm. Only from a different spiritual perspective may we, possibly, if we are serious about it, and put the spirit first, perceive a positive future, and only a positive future can do us genuine good. Spiritual preparation for war, looking beyond mortal life, in both directions. Bruce Charlton. As the Sorithic powers do their best to escalate the current war in scope and severity, preparation becomes urgent, and since this is primarily a spiritual war, and the world is more evil affiliated than ever before, so far as we know, spiritual preparation is primary. The main spiritual preparation for an increased possibility of death, oneself perhaps, but more likely from the broader range of loved ones, family, friends, neighbors, is to be on the right side. This means having primary affiliation not to any socio-political entity, but to the side of God, divine creation and Jesus Christ, to want salvation and be prepared to leave behind all your sins, i.e. repent, in order to reach heaven. But, beyond that, I think it is a great help to put this mortal life into context, which, for me, is to look beyond mortal life in both directions. That is, our life now is in a frame, from within which we should both be looking back to before this incarnated/embodied mortal life, as well as looking forward to after and beyond this life, to what comes after the body dies. In other words, we need to understand that birth was not the beginning nor is death the end, and we urgently need to sort out the relevant realities of this situation for ourselves, what it implies for us, and for everyone else. This means that, as well as acknowledging your basic situation, you ought to continue and analyze whether or not you are really satisfied with what you currently are telling yourself is really true. And whether you personally endorse your current understanding of the human condition from your deepest intuitive convictions. Whether, that is, you are prepared to take individual responsibility for your convictions, and not try to hand over ultimate responsibility to some external institution or source. As of 2023, as we now are, only on such a basis can we be prepared for death, which is vital whether or not any of us, later or soon, are involved in a destructive war. Mainstream left-right totalitarians, versus the radical left, agents of chaos, office politics among the demon-affiliated. Bruce Charlton. The left includes all of the discourse in the public space, so it can be called more accurately the left-right, which primary objective is totalitarian, that is, it aims at omni-surveillance and total control, with the spiritual objective of normalizing and propagating value inversion, and thereby mass human damnation. The left has a minority radical wing, whose primary objective is chaos, i.e. violent revolution. The radical left are agents of chaos, their methods are often chaotic, and they desire increased chaos as an outcome. The mainstream totalitarian left and the radical revolutionaries can be distinguished, in terms of their priority and main methods, but they cannot be divided, because they are both part of the same movement of the left, and each depends on the other. The totalitarians need the radical, because radicals are the fantasy heroes, inventors, and conscience, actually, a kind of inverted anti-conscience, of the bureaucrats and functionaries. The radicals are the energy and inspiration, the avant-garde, and the totalitarians follow. And the radicals need the totalitarians, because it is the bureaucrats and mass media who create the protected and subsidized environment in which radicals can survive and thrive, which provide exposure and influence via the media, and who defend the radicals against the only real enemies of the left-right, i.e. real Christians. What we are seeing at present is one of the periodic spats of office politics within the left-right. The demon-serving powers of evil who sit above the mainstream have set up a new leftist civil war within the mainstream, a war between the totalitarian majority mainstream, who support one side, and the radical minority mainstream who support the other. This new war will energize and entertain the mainstream of both kinds, especially those who have become bored and directionless. It gives them something urgent to fight for. The 2022 war was useless for this purpose, because the entire mainstream, both totalitarians and radicals, were solidly united in opposition to the Fire Nation. Dull, dull, dull. But the totalitarians and radicals of the mainstream are really excited just now. Both taking hard lines, and flinging outrageous accusations at each other, because this is a power struggle within the party, among those who currently control the world. Because it is a power struggle among individuals of totalitarian and radical caste, the personal stakes are high. Potential rewards and punishments are extremely different according to who is winning. But it is fun, also, because, unlike the Fire Nation situation, where mainstream dissent is crushed, ultimately the new war stakes are so low. The stakes are low in the sense that neither side of the mainstream can really win, therefore, ultimately, at least among those who aren't merely dupes, neither totalitarians nor radicals really want to win, in the sense of permanently vanquishing their enemy. Individuals and parties within the left just want more power for themselves and their gang. That's all. They are all on the same side, totalitarians and radicals' sides need each other, and work together in synergy. However this new war turns out for the agents of chaos personally, the radicals have already won. They have already won even if, for instance, all the radicals are soon stripped of power, imprisoned or killed. Because it is easy to make new radicals. If necessary, new, replacement radicals can be generated by the mainstream at the drop of a hat and in large numbers, in just a few days or weeks, as was discovered in the 1960s and confirmed in the summer of 2020. The radicals have already won, because the world has been pushed much further towards the chaos they desire, towards some kind of system collapse. And the totalitarians have already lost, because, with every passing week, the global bureaucrats have less and less control of humanity's attitudes, thoughts, behaviors. And while radicals are quick and easy to produce, it has taken many decades to build the system. This is, perhaps, an exemplar of Sayre's law, which states that in any dispute the intensity of feeling is inversely proportional to the value of the issues. The reason is probably that personal stakes are relatively highest when matters of fundamental value are least, maybe because when micro-issues of merely relative value are concerned, then the reason for such differences are mostly personal. How the thinking of one person can change the world for the better. Bruce Charlton. I regard it as a simple fact that the thinking of a single person can change the world, and for the better. 1. It is thinking that has the effect, not necessarily a physical action. 2. As little as one person thinking may be effectual, not necessarily any group, institution or nation. 3. Change the world, i.e. the external world, the world, including people, outside the brain of the thinker. 4. For the better, which is change positively and in line with the will and intention of God. Provoking widespread negative change is easy and common, a spiteful gossip can do it, but I am here talking about a positive and personal contribution to all of divine creation. It may be helpful to draw together the assumptions that lie behind such a statement. 1. Thoughts are actions in the real world. I was originally convinced of this by Rudolf Steiner's Truth and Knowledge, and the Philosophy of Freedom, and the work of Owen Barfield, such as Saving the Appearances. 2. We live in a creation, and God is the creator, loves us and is concerned with us each as individuals. All human beings constitute, in some literal sense, God's family of children. 3. Therefore, God is able and willing, through his ongoing creation, to take up, amplify and spread through creation any specific thought, or other action, from any one of his children, when this thought contributes positively to the goals of creation. Our main business, therefore, is to think good, positive thoughts, true, beautiful, virtuous, and if we do this, then God can and will take up these thoughts, and make of them what he will in the world at large. Read not the times. William Wildblood. It may seem a little redundant to write pieces on general spiritual themes with all that is going on in the world today, but in fact that makes it all the more important to lift our mental focus above the chaos of current events to the deeper reality beyond. It's easy to get caught up in external conflict and take sides, but for the spiritual person that temptation should generally be resisted. I'm not saying there is not right and wrong, nor that in a dispute both sides are equally good or bad. That is clearly not the case, but we do need to fix our minds on the eternal rather than the times. Pace Thoreau. Was it not because Jesus did just that he was betrayed by Judas, who wanted him to take a more active position with regard to Jewish liberation from Roman rule? That is one theory anyway, and it is true that Jesus did not involve himself in politics or worldly disputes any more than any bona fide spiritual teacher has done. Passions can be aroused, the sense of justice can be appealed to, but we have to see that our emotions are being played upon to bring us down from a higher standpoint. This does not mean we make ourselves insensitive to human suffering and evil, but we do not become psychologically involved, because if we do we will lose connection to higher truth. This is what resist not evil means. It does not mean we let evil have free play, but we do not let it into our hearts by reacting to it on its own terms and according to the agenda it sets. This can be a tricky balance to strike. There will be many attempts to distract the spiritually focused from their proper task of following God. To inflame their minds so that their judgment is clouded and they allow themselves to be drawn into worldly battles. I am not saying we should always stand aside, but we must be alive to the manipulation that is going on and not react emotionally. That can be hard, especially if one is personally involved, and it is equally important that one remains alive to worldly suffering, or you risk falling into the spirituality of self-satisfied solipsism. But you must be careful not to let evil pull you down to its own level, which is something it is always trying to do to those who seek to extricate themselves from its clutches. Surely you can see how first thing then another comes about to engage our emotions and pull us into earthly concerns. When one starts to grow stale, up pops something else. We will be told we are unfeeling, inhuman, not to take sides, especially in the face of evil actions, but that is where discernment is called for. Evil is always seeking to draw us into its net, and has no compunction about tactics. Don't react to its provocations unless you are directly concerned, and even then never lose sight of God, and the real spiritual truth of God, not an image of him, that may have been created for some non-spiritual purpose as exists in all religions, especially the ones currently involved. This is not a call for pacifism nor for tolerance of evil, but now more than ever is a time for detachment and discernment, and to remember that love is not an emotion. Nostalgia. Bruce Charlton. Nostalgia was originally used to describe a kind of pathological, painful, even potentially fatal, homesickness, but is now much more widely used to mean a yearning for something in the past, time of life, place, person, group, which yearning may be deep, rich and pleasurable. Although it is generally regarded as a rather weak and sentimental affliction, I regard nostalgia as, in itself, a good thing, especially in potential, because to experience nostalgia is a sign of depth of nature, perhaps evidence of the capability for love, a looking beyond the currently dominating incentives of here and now. But nostalgia is just a beginning, and what matters is what happens next. Like most things, nostalgia can lead to bad outcomes. For example, it can lead to the attempt to return to childhood, or a futile attempts to rebuild that which has irrevocably gone, and which probably ought not to be rebuilt anyway. This error might be termed nostalgia as an end in itself. It may also represent, or lead to, a spiritually dangerous things, which is trying to recover and relive an earlier stage of oneself, trying to undo and forget, rather than learn from and repent, aspects of one's life. Or, the opposite, the impossibility of returning to the earlier situation may lead to a kind of despair. The past is seen as entropically doomed because the world inevitably decays, our memory always degrades, the past is annihilated, death by destruction is the end of all. This error might be termed nostalgia as a deceptive, because unattainable, vision of the impossible good. Either way, nostalgia can lead to a kind of life-sapping attitude, especially in a secular materialist society such as ours, one which favors and rewards psychopathic callousness, which perhaps accounts for nostalgia's low-status reputation. If, on the other hand, someone has an assumption of his own life as a stage and phase in the experience of an eternal soul, and has the expectation of resurrected life in heaven to follow death, then nostalgia can assume a very positive role in life, and beyond. Nostalgia, potentially, points us in a direction that recognizes the positive value of our own past experiences, and these experiences may include imaginative and empathic experiences, for example the best experiences from reading, arts, television, and the experiences of people with whom we identify, both those people we have known or met, and those about whom we have learned. We may realistically expect such nostalgia experienced in this mortal life, to form, in ways not explicitly comprehensible at present, a vital part of our eternal life in heaven.